Hi guys, I'm Ransom Riggs and I am moderating this wonderful panel, Modern Magic World Building, which is how do you draw from reality for your inspiration when reality is a garbage fire. So we're all gonna figure that out. I'd love you panelists, you lovely folks, to introduce yourselves and tell us about your latest book and maybe flash it on the screen or something. We'll start with, I was gonna call on you, Francesca, but you're reaching. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay, Francesca Flores.
It's very convenient that my book is right behind me. Hi, I'm Francesca Flores, and my debut is Diamond City. It came out in January. It's about an assassin uncovering a conspiracy, and I am here with Hedwig today. So that's that.
We have Margaret.
Hi, I'm Margaret Rogerson. I'm the author of Sorcery of Thorns, is my most recent novel. It's about a girl who's an apprentice at a magical library where the books are alive.
Frances Hardinge.
Hello, I'm Frances Hardinge, and my latest book is called Deep Light. This is the UK version. The US version looks a bit more like that. And it's set in an alternative world where a set of really unpleasant deep sea gods have terrorized islanders for centuries before unexpectedly all tearing each other apart.
Tracy Wolff.
My latest book is called Crave, and it is the story of a young girl who ends up transferring to a boarding school in Alaska after her parents died to live with her only remaining family members. And as she kind of wanders through the world, she figures out that the students there are anything but normal. She's amid vampires and dragons and witches and werewolves.
Adalyn Grace.
Yeah, hi, I'm Adalyn Grace. My first book is All the Stars and Teeth. It just came out in February. It is a young adult fantasy about a morally gray princess who has to team up with a pirate in order to save her kingdom from a magical new threat. It is a big magical adventure.
And last but not least, Melissa Albert.
Hi, I'm Melissa Albert. My first book was The Hazelwood, and my second book is The Night Country. That's this, it's hiding in my background. Okay, it's the sequel that came out last January. It's about a girl whose grandmother wrote a dark book of fairy tales, and the world of the fairy tales is stalking her, and they continue to be a problem in book 2.
Awesome, that all sounds amazing. And I'm Ransom Riggs, and I showed you a thing from my book beforehand, but this is it. It's called The Conference of the Birds. It's number 5 in my ongoing Peculiar Children series. And I am very excited to be here moderating this cool panel. It's something I have been wondering about quite a bit. The world is a garbage fire at the moment. Insane, bizarre things are happening every day. The news is stranger than fiction. So, you know, I once got a letter from a fan who was, I think, a young fan, like 9 or 10, and she said, "I enjoy your books even though time travel is fake." Is it, devil's advocate, is it useful to create fantasy when real world problems are so urgent? What do you guys think? You know what we could do rather than calling on people at random? If anyone has an urgent answer, you could raise your hand. Tracy.
I was going to say, I think it's more than, I think it's incredibly important to do it at a time when the world is in such a dangerous state for a couple different reasons. I think one, people need the escape. Absolutely, it gives them something else that they can fall into for a little while and not concentrate on all of the fears and all of the worries that they have to face every single day. But I also think that fantasy and paranormal worlds are a really, really great place to be able to explore problems in our own world, but outside of the like political charge or whatever else that surrounds them, right? If you set them in a fantasy world, for example, Crave Deals has a whole sub-thread that's going to run through the whole thing, whole series that deals with like born vampire supremacy, for example, and some other things that I think that when you try and deal with them in the world we live in, is incredibly terrifying and very politically charged. But I think that if you take them outside and you look at them somewhere else, it lets people leave their passion and their worry and their own bias or whatever you want to call it at home and just kind of look at it freely. So I think, yeah, absolutely.
I feel weird. I feel like I'm the teacher. Just talk.
Yeah, you know, similar to what Tracy said, I think fantasy has a really strong power in its capability as a genre, in that you look at similar problems in our world through a completely different lens. And in a way, I think that helps engender more empathy in the reader for what they're reading about. Maybe it's a situation in the world that they currently don't have empathy for. But then they read it in a fantasy world and they start to think about it differently, and they're put into the character's head while that character is dealing with whatever issue you're writing about. And so it can, I don't know, it can foster a lot of conversation. Even I think the magic helps foster that, because you're being plunged into this different perspective, and everything is emphasized in a fantasy world. Everything has really strong emotions and impact. So I think it's great.
Yeah. Do you guys, if anyone else has an answer, let me know. Otherwise, we'll just chat at random. I would, piggybacking on both of those great answers, I was just thinking, I feel like we've all chosen to write fantasy because it sort of calls to us. Is that because, for any of you, you feel like you can talk about things that matter to you more effectively through fantasy? Or just because you love magical worlds?
Can I talk?
Yes, please.
For me, it's just because I love magical worlds. I've never been a fan of, I was the kid who read like the Chronicles of Narnia and had zero idea that it was an allegory of any kind. It seems pretty obvious in retrospect. But yeah, I love reading a fantasy novel and finding that like the message in it, if there is one, is something that kind of like sits with you and grows over time. I would never want it to be explicit either in my own work or something that I've read. So yeah, for me, it's pure joy and like the magic. And if there's something under that like bolsters it, then that's, you know, delightful, but never what I'm like seeking.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I've always just been, I feel like I've been like chasing magic my entire life, like ever since I was a kid. And the best way for me to find that was in stories, whether they were like books or video games or TV shows or anything like that. I do like that we get to explore things. And like Francesca was saying, we get to explore things a little bit more intimately because everything is amplified in books. But yeah, for me, I'm kind of like Melissa, where it's just like I've been chasing magic, and that is why I want to create these big magical worlds, so I get to live in it and I don't get to think about everything happening around me.
I think I have always found that actually magical worlds, they do actually speak to me as a much easier way of expressing things that I feel about the world anyway. That's just something that comes very naturally to me. And I'm wondering if that's because I tend to see the world in quite a, well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm already living in an extremely surprising, slightly surreal, perverse world. So fantasy actually seems like quite a realistic way of conveying that.
Yeah. And I feel like there's a lag in our ability to understand and process what the hell is going on in the world and our reality. But if we can build our own, you know, world, then we can control it, and we can deal with, you know, whatever is speaking to us at the moment. But I mean, I'm not ready for a slew of books about pandemic. Are you guys ready for Pandemic Lit? I don't want to read about this for a while. How long do you think it's going to take before we start seeing dystopian pandemic books all over?
Not very long.
Yeah, I feel like they're going to start like right away. I don't know if I'm like super into that because it feels so surreal because we're living it right now. But I feel like when you are living something or experience something, you know, it fills your creative well too. And you want to kind of discuss it and examine it in your story. So I don't think it's going to take very long.
Have you guys been seeking out that kind of, are you like rereading Station 11? Or are you totally avoiding dystopias right now?
Totally avoiding.
I've watched a few pandemic movies. Don't ask why. I don't know why. But they're like ridiculous ones, like things that would never
never actually happen.
Yeah, and now that we're like in a pandemic, I'll see those movies and I'll be like, none of you are socially distancing.
I'm getting that
Well, there's
with
something
sitcoms
really
right now.
Yeah, or they come up with a vaccine in like a week.
right. There's something really empowering, right? About being able to create a world and define the rules, right? Especially when you're living in a world that feels like the rules are all out of control. Like there's nothing, like all of us right now are kind of feeling, I think, or most of us, that we're out of control, that we don't have control of our own lives. We don't have control out of anything besides like our little microcosm in our little house, apartment, whatever it is, and our social distancing. But any number of things, like my house alone, right? We've had like a major burn accident. We just had this like major slice of a hand open. We've had any number of things happen. And I'm like, oh my God, we would have been to a doctor in a heartbeat like a month ago. And now we're just kind of like dealing with it. So I think there's something really comforting in creating a world where you define the rules and you define what happens at a time, and reading those kind of worlds at a time when you feel so out of control about other things.
Maybe I'm contrary, but I tend to create worlds where the rules are changing, just so all the poor little people who are living in the worlds get thrown into horrible confusion. So I should never become a god. I'd be a horrible god.
It's like you'd be a very
Go back
realistic
to the Greeks.
It feels like the world we're living in now. I feel like I've been seeing everywhere things like, oh, Shakespeare wrote King Lear in quarantine. And does that make you, like me, want to go, shut up? Or do you find being cooped up, for weeks on end helpful and inspiring?
I have personally not found myself to be nearly as productive as I hoped I would be.
Yeah, it's funny. I thought that since I was going to be, stuck in like my office and in a chair, that I would magically write like 5,000,000 words. That is not a thing. I feel like it's way harder to focus. Deadlines have been way harder. I've gotten to the point where I almost want to dedicate book 2 to coronavirus, just because it's just like, yeah, I don't know how I'm doing this. I feel like if this book publishes, that is like in this time, that is amazing.
It's inspiring me to write more things that are like completely escapist. So I started out the whole like shelter in place thing not being super productive, but I just got back edit notes for my second book last week, or the week before, What is Time? And so I'm working on that, and I'm also working on like 2 projects for fun. Just starting last week, I started being productive, but the other 2 projects are like, so I don't know, they just have a lot of like jokes, and they're really like fun, and there's a lot of like sweet relationships. It's not as violent as my book 2, so it's a nice break.
Ransom, I'd love to ask you the same question, because I think our kids are on the same age, and my kid is napping right now, but he's actually yelling lines from Pete the Cat really loudly. So I'm curious how you're finding it. Make me feel better.
Well, yeah, no, it's tough. We're a bit lucky because we have in-home care. Taha's mom helps us out, and she's part of our family bubble. So we still have some childcare, which is nice, but just being home all the time and being in the same environment, and there's definitely a lot more, it's all hands on deck for everybody. So yeah, it's immensely distracting. And I mean, we're supposed to be built for this, right? We're writers. We are like in our chair. Like sometimes I'll be on deadline, and for a week, like the most exotic thing I could do is go for a walk in this neighborhood. But the news is distracting. Theoretically, I can turn off the news and stop clicking on the New York Times website, but like it's still there. There's this constant hum of apocalypse nattering at me. And you would think that it would be inspiring somehow, because it is the stuff from which some of our novels are made. It's like absurdist, end of the world, dystopian fiction, but it's reality. But tell me if you guys feel the same. Like,
Totally.
the people running the apocalypse and who are starring in it are so dumb that I would never write my characters like that. It would be too uninteresting to watch. They have to be intelligent villains. It's frustrating.
I feel like we got to give ourselves like more credit for creating anything in this time right now, because it's so distracting, everything going on in the news, everything like you're saying, there's some decisions that are very, very poor, and you hear them and you're just like, why? And I feel like that's really like stifling at least my creative juices, like, but we can't exactly stop, especially if we have like deadlines. We're trying to get a book out like next year. Like, it is so much more difficult to be creative right now. And I feel like we just kind of like need to give ourselves credit for that, but also just understand that sometimes you just have to like sit down and play a video game or watch a movie or hang out with whoever you're quarantining with and just kind of let your mind like relax. Cause it's a lot of pressure right now. We're not really like always thinking about that or like letting ourselves feel that.
I've even started keeping a spreadsheet just to prove to myself that I'm doing things each day. You know, little categories like social, work, exercise, and stuff like that. Gives me an illusion of control. But yeah, I've had to limit how much the news I listen to, or you just end up feeling like you've got a head full of wasps.
Wow. Yes, a head full of wasps.
I mean, that's the problem, right? Because we're so out of control. You were talking about like watching like clownish villains, and right, this whole idea of so much of this, like, we can't control. It's decisions made. I live in Austin, Texas, and they're talking about like opening up our state, you know, and I'm like, is it like most of us realize it's not time to open up the state? They haven't even tested 1% of the people in the state, right? But you're sitting here and you're like, this is something I don't have control over. So it is. So you're sitting here and you're working and you're trying to immerse yourself in this world, but like little thoughts and little fears and little, like, you know, my mother has severe COPD and she also is living in the house with us. So we're like super careful, right? And I think, you know, what happens if they do this? And like, what happens if, you know, and she if something happens to her and I've got to take her to the doctor out of this, and, you know, yeah. So how do you immerse yourself in a world? And I love the spreadsheet idea. I'm totally going to steal that, Francis, because like, yeah, I'm sitting here and I'm working because I'm on deadline too, as we all are. And I'm sitting here and I'm working and I'm thinking, oh gosh, did this happen? Or oh my gosh, oh, my mom's coughing, or oh my God, you know, and it's really, it's again, I think it's that lack of control, right? The total dissolution of everything that we deem normal in such a quick space.
So when it comes to world building and drawing on reality, I mean, I think we all do it unconsciously, but some of us, I think, do it very consciously. I'm not one of those people. I don't set out with an agenda. I want to talk about this and I'm going to transmute it into fiction in this complicated way. But like, do any of you guys work that way? Or is it all just sort of, you read it later and you're like, oh, look at what I did?
Yeah, I'm very much your way. I don't set out with a manifesto and then cunningly disguise it as a story. I start out basically with some weird concepts and then sort of try and think them through logically and build out the world around them so that it sort of starts to feel concrete and hold together. And at certain points, the things that I'm concerned about, fascinated about, angry about, afraid of, etc., just kind of creep in. You know, the bees in my bonnet come out for a little buzz.
Yeah, it's definitely never complete. Like when I first start thinking about it, like more stuff always does get added. But I do find that I think of the world first. I do get a little bit of character inspiration at the beginning, usually the main character, but I really like to flesh out the world. So I guess I do get some of those ideas earlier on because I will try to include like conflicts from our own history to make it more realistic. Like my debut has a lot of kind of subtle references to Latin American and Colombian history. And so it does work in there a little bit, but I don't start with like a moral goal until a bit later in the planning process. And it always gets fleshed out or changed as the book continues.
Okay. Oh, sorry, keep going.
No, go ahead, Ransom.
No, this is such a new format that I'm like, okay, how do I read the silences? It's because everyone is on Zoom. So
No, I was just going to say, I feel like as much as I'm an outliner, I'm a plotter, but as much as I do that, it really isn't until editing and after I've written the first draft that I kind of see more of like what I'm going for. So I feel like there's little threads that you write in and then you're like, oh, that's the story I was actually trying to tell. And then it actually takes shape in editing. I don't feel like I set out with any goals or I even know about them until editing.
I actually start out with a character and a situation. I think that's like so true. There's so much of what happens in it later on. You're like, oh right, and this is where we really need to go and let's flesh it out. But I'd love to say that I start out with the world, but I really just start out with a person, usually a character that's talking in the back of my head, and whether that character is a witch or a vampire or I've written all kinds of things. But anyway, whatever it is, this character just kind of starts talking to me. And then I start thinking like, well, who are they and where are they and why are they, why are they in my head and what kind of a world do they live in? And I start fleshing from that. I always think I should start, you always think you should do something different than what your process is. I don't know. I've always thought so. I've done 65 books and I'm always like, my process sucks. I should do somebody else's process. It would be better. But you're kind of stuck with yours, right? And so I always start with this character talking in my head, and then I kind of figure out where they are in the world and why they're going through whatever it is they're talking to me about.
I feel like I wasn't sure what my first book was about until other people read it and told me. Like I wrote the whole thing, and then I had to sit down and do the thing where if you're a debut, you query agents. And when I had to actually write down what it was about, I was like, I wrote a whole book that's about nothing, like a Seinfeld episode book. And yeah, it took maybe the intervening 2 years for readers to come in and talk about it, and then now I can't remember what I used to think it was about. But really smart people have since told me, and that's now how I talk about it.
It means you're accessing something, deep inside you, which is probably good and saves us money on therapy. Have any of you guys ever written a first draft and just that was what got published? Really?
Whoa.
Damn.
That was actually...
That happens?
No
yeah,
editing.
well, I mean, there are revisions, but I'm mostly my process sucks. I'm a one draft writer. I do the first.
That process.
No, but it's like a one draft in 10 days kind of a thing. Like I start it and then I get stalled out at like chapter 3 and then I just think about it. And if I'm on deadline, it's very stressful because I'm like, I need to get going on this, but there's nothing there. And then it kind of like all kind of comes together, the world, the things, whatever. And then in 10 days, it kind of like pours out. And I mean, sure, there are like minor revisions or whatever, but yeah.
Can I have your process?
No, it's terrible because like those 10 days or 2 weeks, like I don't move, like my whole house falls apart, like you have to dig it out with like a dump truck by the end of the 2 weeks. I have 3 boys and I'm all twisted up and I haven't slept and I'm barely coherent and it's not
I do that for months.
Okay.
You should feel bad for all of us, Tracy. You have a great process.
I don't know, that wandering time is not good.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of our magical worlds start often from a single seed of inspiration. It could be a character, like an object. So can you tell me from your most recent book, what was the seed that grew it?
So I started the story with the main character, but it's all I knew. I only knew her. I knew that I wanted her to have some vicious form of magic, but it wasn't until I was listening to the Witcher 3 soundtrack and there was this like witch chant song that came on. It was like, and I was like, cool, death magic, blood, dark world, got it. So that is what that is literally what inspired the world. It was the Witcher 3 soundtrack.
Writing that down right now.
I really like that soundtrack.
It's good. It's creepy, but it's good.
For me, it's usually some obscure or contradictory thing that I find in like myth or folklore that inspires me to come up with like a setting or a magic system. For my most recent book, there's this 17th century grimoire called The Lesser Key of Solomon. It's about demonology and like the conjuration of demons. And one thing that I always thought was really interesting about it is that it has like this list of like 72 demons that you can summon what their names are and what they will grant you if you summon them. And they're always like, this is like Stolas, the Prince of Hell, the commander of 50 demonic legions. And if you summon him, he'll teach you about rocks and minerals. And there's another one that'll help you with your relationship problems. And I always just thought that's such an interesting contrast. And that sort of ended up forming the basis of the magic system and one of the characters in my most recent book.
That's so cool.
Frances, what about you?
I'm awkward. I'm afraid I don't tend to have a single seed. I tend to have ideas that have been sort of hanging around in my head for a while that I know are partial ideas. So they just sit in the back of my brain like dust bunnies. And they gradually accumulate other neighbouring dust bunnies and sort of form a clump. Oh, this is all sounding quite unpleasant. But I mean, for Deep Light, that's a mixture of some interesting childhood nightmares, scuba diving experiences, an interest in early 18th century submarines, some of which were great. They're sort of made of wood and some had little oars sticking out the side. And a fascination with the idea of, well, these legends where all the gods die. You know, legends like Ragnarok, but thinking about that in terms of, well, okay, what's it actually like for people who live through that and perhaps survive that and then pick themselves out of the rubble and say, well, what actually just happened? Oh, well, actually, no, there's bits of gods around. Oh, these seem to be quite useful. So it's I'm afraid it's just an unholy kludge of various different partial ideas.
Unholy Kludge is a really good book title.
Really good. Yeah, everything.
I mean, inspiration comes from like anything. Like I remember last year, I literally got a book idea from the pattern of whorls of wood on a door. It looked like three girls without like faces or mouths. Come to think of it, it looked like three girls wearing face masks. But I thought of like this demon thing where they didn't have mouths there. Yeah. Anyway, but my debut, Diamond City, the part of the world that came first to me was that I wanted it to be in the middle of industrialization, because I really like writing about societies that are in the middle of big change. And so I have the technology, which is like a lot of like steam trains and like things like that. It has like a steampunk feel without being a steampunk novel, really. And so I wanted to show that kind of in conflict with this traditional usage of blood magic and religion, and just like put them up against each other. And yeah, I just like seeing how technology in different eras of history will change a whole society. So industrialization.
I think everyone in the Q&A I'm looking through, and a lot of people are asking the most basic question really of world building, which is how do you develop your elaborate magical worlds? I'm sure everyone has a slightly different answer.
All right, I go first.
Mark and Colin, people at Ransom. It's scarier.
I feel like, so for me, I want to make worlds feel as like very much their own as possible. So for me, it comes down to, I like to look at, what kind of magic system do they have, if there's magic, and how does that magic influence their world in terms of like, what jobs do they have? And those jobs will determine like, what do they wear? What do they eat? What does the landscape look like? And I want to build it from the ground up. So the magic, and then how does that influence the different aspects of their life? And I feel like in doing that, at least for me, I'm able to create worlds that feel very much their own and a lot more organic that way.
I find that I sometimes, coming up with high fantasy settings, I can really easily get lost in the details, and then I find myself just sort of coming up with all these really complex world building ideas, and then I reach a point where I can't create a plot because I have so much world building that I don't know how to fit it into a plot. So I've had to sort of train myself to instead come up with the characters and the plot first, and then I create the magic and the world building alongside them to sort of help the story along, rather than doing it first, because I do tend to get really bogged down.
I tend to not write high fantasy. I love to read it, but I just tend to not write it. One of the things that I like one of the things the biggest challenge I think for me is trying to create a world, a separate world inside the world that we already live in. It's why I like writing urban fantasy. It's why I like writing paranormal set in you know, our modern world. And so for me, when I go to create the world, I tend to create it very broadly at first. Like I start with a character, like I said, and I start with where this character is and who they are and what they want and what's standing in their way, you know, all the basic stuff. And then from there, I kind of build the world and the blocks, stumbling blocks, and all of those things around them. And I know a very broad world going in, but it's not until I really get in and start writing that, you know, you run into situations, you're like, oh yeah, well, I need a rule for that. And oh yeah, I need something here. Like in Crave, there's this whole underground dungeon tunnel area that I built, and it was really out of necessity because how do vampires get around during the day if they need to get to classrooms that are further out of the, you know, the main castle and all that. And then it actually later on became this whole, you know, historical dragon lair thing that's I'm exploring in book 2. So I think a lot of the world building actually comes from pure necessity, right? The whole, I need to do these things. How do I do them? What do they look like in this world that I've created?
My obsession in fantasy and fiction in general has always been like the intrusion of magical into the normal. So like a real world with intrusions of magic. Urban fantasy, you know, is one of my genres. Contemporary fantasy in general. So I think when I wrote The Hazelwood is a portal fantasy, and so it's a night country. Writing the portal world, I wanted to have like a fantastical world with intrusions of the ordinary, like kind of just invert that idea that I love. And yeah, that something about that contrast has always been like pure fictional drug to me. So yeah, that's kind of how I did it.
So when I'm making a fantastical world, I'll often start with just a few completely screwy premises, and if at least one of them makes me cackle maliciously, then that's definitely a bonus. And then I'd say I just try and kind of follow out logically or semi-logically from there and try and work out how that would affect society, how it would affect their religion, their superstitions, their economy, like you say, the jobs that people would have, and their history, the stories they'll tell about themselves, and just build it out from there so that the whole thing sort of holds together and can be convincing, even if the foundations are fundamentally screwy. And it's at that point I start to properly understand my characters. And once I've answered a lot of my own questions about how this whole world works, that tends to throw up lots of other plot ideas as well, because you realize there'll be certain groups, certain people, certain places, certain inventions, and then you can kind of recruit them into your storyline. Having said that, I totally know what Margaret means about ending up with an enormously elaborate structure of world building which can't fit entirely into one book. And I've had to resign myself to the fact that there will be some things that I know about in my worlds that my readers don't have to know about.
Yeah.
That
But
actually
anyway, because
dovetails
even
pretty
when
well.
you end up having to cut from the, it still has an effect on the world. So it's great when you like have in the back of your head. After I make you know, the world with like the history and how the culture and the way the magic and everything influences it, things that really help me flesh it out are thinking of the way the power structure is set up in society and whether it's different from our world or not, and if it is different, like how that affects the way the characters interact with each other. And one other thing I like is thinking whether the characters in that world have a different set of morals than we do in our world, and if they do, like why, and how the world influence these characters to operate on the moral compass that they have. Like the main character in Diamond City is an assassin, and so to have readers root for an assassin, I need to make a world where that isn't very uncommon, or where people have a moral compass that is a lot more gray than ours. So that helps me flesh out worlds too, thinking of that.
We only have a few minutes left, so I've got to hurry, but I've been wanting to ask this. I saw a quote the other day by a guy named Lincoln Michael, who says, in a perfectly executed work of world building, there would be no gaps in the world for the reader to fill in. Everything from the goblin's favorite type of baby wipes to the export taxes on Martian ray guns would be worked out, at least in the author's mind, if not on the page. So is that nuts? How much do you put in and how much do you leave out? Do you think it's important for there to be gaps for the reader's imagination to fill in?
I do think gaps are important because I think that that adds realism to a world, and especially if you're writing fantasy or a fairy tale type of story. I think a lot of things about a fairy tale are actually defined by sort of the things that are not able to be explained. So yeah, I disagree.
I also disagree. I'm thinking about taking that kind of state of mind and applying it to contemporary fiction, and talking about like someone making an omelet and like going through every detail of how much the eggs cost and where they got their cheese grater from IKEA or whatever. Yes, so no, the gaps are what like haunt me and keep me reading and keep me thrilled about a world. I mean, I love those books that as you kind of walk through them, you feel like a throwaway sentence about maybe like how religion works in that world. You're like, that could be a whole novel. Like that is what I love. So
yeah,
I
and then
disagree.
the reader is filling in those gaps. They're like looking at the world that you've already built and they're imagining things based on that. So they're still thinking of things within the realm of the world you've created, and they're just like extrapolating from that. So it just allows more imagination. Yeah.
Absolutely. I agree. Just drop them in, and then it's like they're inhabiting the world rather than being read a travelogue. And besides, the gaps are what allow fanfic writers to operate, and we don't want to
That's
stop
what I
them.
was gonna say, right? If they wanted you to fill in everything, we wouldn't have a thriving fanfic, universe out there, right? Because readers love to take your characters or your world and invent their own stuff for it and their own things and their own scenarios. No, I think it's so much more exciting when you leave the gaps for them.
Yeah, and I think like just looking at our world too, like I understand, I don't know, 1% of it, and there's so many different like variations of different things, like, and then we're supposed to create a world and have it be totally understandable, no gaps, like that just doesn't feel natural to me whatsoever. I think it's way more fun to have the gaps and the different like variations where you can kind of drift off into different things.
I think the readers expect us to know everything about the world, and I often get questions from people about, what the magical creature's favorite flavor of ice cream is. But that's the sort of illusion that makes this whole thing work. It's that you can drop in enough detail for it to feel complete without actually being totally complete, which is how we, can write a book in like 6 months instead of 20 years. That's wonderful. And that's it. That's our 40 minutes. It flew by. And I want to thank you guys for all being here virtually, if not actually. And hopefully next year you can come in person. It'd be so nice. So have a nice rest of the pandemic as much as you can. Be well, stay safe, self-care. And I hope you guys are all doing okay out there. Thank you for coming to watch us talk about world building, and enjoy the next panel.